Okay, I see there's already plenty of people who joined us here today, and Laura Holden is here, so we can get started. Welcome everyone to the Café Scientifique, the public outreach webinar of the EU Horizon Project Precision TOX. My name is Leonie Müller. I'm the Precision TOX Communication Coordinator and your host this afternoon. Today we're going to hear a presentation by Laura Holden, who will give us an overview about the chemical regulation and how NAMs fit in there. Her talk will be around 30 to 40 minutes interaction and discussion afterwards. Do you hear me all right? I think my computer is saying I have a bit of connection issues. So I'll just get through the introduction and hand over to Laura, who has a stable internet connection, I think. Okay, so we will have a presentation by Laura for around 30 minutes, and we will have plenty of time for interaction discussion afterwards. We have the Q&A open, so if you have questions throughout our talk, just put your questions in the Q&A and I can read them out afterwards. But if you feel comfortable afterwards, you can raise your hand and I can also pull you up to the screen and you can interact with Laura directly, so we can have some proper interaction and discussion here today. I just want to make everyone aware that this meeting is recorded and it will be put up on the Precision TOX website to be viewed afterwards, but also just so you're aware, if you put in questions with your name or so raise your hand here on screen, that you're aware that this is recorded and will be on the internet forever afterwards. If you have any other questions or technical issues, make sure to put them in the chat directed at me and I'll get in touch with you. Now I want to briefly introduce our guest. Laura Holden has a background in environmental science. She joined the Birmingham Law School in 2022 as a research fellow, working on many different projects, but also for the Precision TOX project. So she's an early stage researcher from the Precision TOX Consortium, and she pursues a PhD. Her research focuses on science-based decision-making, and today she's going to talk about, as I said earlier, just the chemical regulation overview and how NAMs fit into this topic. So now I'm happy to hand over to Laura.
Thanks, Leonie. Okay, so the usual, I'm going to share my screen. So hopefully that's showing in the correct mode.
Yes, it is.
Great, thanks. So yeah, thanks, Leonie, for the introduction, and thank you to everyone for joining. So I'm from the law school, involved in the Precision TOX project, which is also part of ASPIS, and also with the PARC project. So yeah, this is just a bit of a tour of chemical regulation with a bit of help of film, music, TV, and really any other medium that I could crowbar into this metaphor. So looking to cover why chemicals are regulated, how this is done, where NAMs come in, and what embedded translation is about in practice. So starting us off then, we begin with Warren G. So he sang about regulate, and he was lamenting that he was having to take matters into his own hands to overcome people stealing his possessions and so on. So really we can take this as being a form of self-regulation. But when we talk about regulating things, maybe a number of different things come into your mind. So you might think of a regulation, or that there's rules or laws or prohibitions. So you tend to be thinking about hard law, things that are binding. But there might also be forms of self-regulation, of standards and permits, which talk about the things that you can and can't do and setting out responsibilities and limits and things like that. But whereas we usually think that regulations are about what you can't do, they're also about what you can do. So if you think about permits, and when we say about environmental permits, so if you've got like industry who want to do an emission to air or to water, this is actually a permission to pollute. We're saying that up to a certain amount, you can add things to the environment that we know are harmful. We're just trying to regulate the amount that pollution happens by. But why is it that we even want to regulate at all? Why do we use that as a route? Why don't we just let people do what they think is right? Why do we want to give civil servants that much control over our lives so that they can tell us what we can and can't do? So this brings us to something called the Pareto optimal, or it's a way of looking at regulation, and it's an economic point of view. And I've crowbarred this in here because it is not the name of a transformer, although that allows me to cover film, toys, graphic novels, and so on. So the idea of the Pareto optimal is that that we, or most of us, live in market economies. So this is an idea of there's supply and demand. So we have markets, and we maybe want to buy something, companies want to sell it. So for instance, if you're looking to buy a car, then you know what you want that car to do. You know the price that you want it to be, you know the type of spec that you want it to have, you know the condition that you want it to be in. So the way that the market works well is if you can find that information easily, then together you can find the supplier and you can make a sale. But that only really works well if you have that information. So if you don't have that information, then that market doesn't work so well. If you look at it in terms of pollution, there's usually a lot of stuff that we don't know about what's going on with pollution. Pollution can be very diffuse in its sources. There can be lots of uncertainty in terms of the harm that pollution can cause. There might be quite a long time lag between the emissions and those harmful effects. And then if you want to get any recourse, lawyers are then expensive. So they're all things that we don't really want to have happen. But that doesn't mean that industry doing this on purpose, that there's any problem, but it's just impacts of the market that we can have. And so what we look to do with regulation is it's good to have some form of accountability, making sure that if something is being supplied in a certain form, that it's meeting the needs that we want it to, but it's also doing those wider social benefits as well of not harming other people or the wider environment. It provides rules so that there's clarity, people know the types of standards that they need to meet. And if we look at like the EU, when we do regulations across many member states, this provides a harmonized approach as well. So this is actually a benefit to business as well as to consumers, because it means that this gives a level playing field to companies as well. So if we then turn to Madonna and our material girl in the material world, this is just another way of saying that chemicals are all around us. So that's not necessarily a bad thing, that chemicals are all around us. We live in a world where that is necessary. And it's not really saying that industry are actually trying to help us, trying to harm us. It doesn't really make sense for businesses to be harming or killing off their customer base. But how much do we really know about the products that we generally are buying? If you were picking up a pen, do you really think about the chemicals that go into the plastics or the ink? Or if you're smelling a perfume, do you think about what you're inhaling? There is a lot of trust in the system, and that's not to say that that is unfounded. It's not to say that that's wrong. Lots of industry do know about what is in the chemicals that they put on the market. But is there someone checking what's going on there? How can we be sure that all industry are making sure that we are being taken care of? And how can we be sure about those unintended consequences? You're picking up a pen. Did anyone really think about when they were making the plastics that there might be transfer or a problem with the chemicals that you're inhaling through perfumes? So a lot of the regulations that we have come at it from a very social perspective, where they come at it from a high level of protection being sought. So when we look at REACH, for instance, the aim of REACH is that there is to be a high level of protection to human health and the environment. If you look at the biocide and pesticides, likewise, that's a high level of protection to human health, animals, and the environment. So these regulations are kind of built up around this idea of industry doing things to help protect us from what is known and what is unknown. But when we talk about chemical regulations, which regulations are we actually talking about? do we know, if we say that we think regulations aren't working, exactly what piece isn't working within that regulation and what knock-on effects it might have if you change or if you don't change something? So we can move to having a look at the chemical world, or the mad world as it may be. So taken here from the Mad World soundtrack by Michael Andrews and Gary Jules, which was known for the Donnie Darko film, although you may also know it from the much better Tears for Fears version. So we can start to piece together what the chemical world looks like. So again, if we take a starting point of REACH, that's a piece of legislation, and it is often quite closely linked to CLP. So here we're talking about the classification, labelling and packaging. So that's very much a hazard focused approach. And the two are quite closely linked because if you're doing a risk assessment, the hazard identification is a main part of that. And CLP is a way of communicating that hazard information. That has its roots in an internationally based system, which was called the Globally Harmonized System, which is a UN approach. But going back to REACH and the idea of animal testing, that has its roots in a European directive. So the Animals in Science 2010-63, the idea that we shouldn't be doing unnecessary harm to animals and so on. But your starting point may not be REACH. You may be working on specific chemicals in these sectors, so pesticides, biocides, pharmaceuticals, veterinary products. And that's your focal point, whereas instead REACH is more of like a safety net for the other chemicals that you work with. And these all take different approaches to how they work. So REACH allows you to market a substance once you've provided the information, whereas pesticides and biocides, there's actually an approval process that you have to go through. So different regulations and different processes within them. On top of that, there's also soft law. So this is now looking at guidance around it. So you may find that on the ECHA website, for example, or the OECD, another sort of quasi-international system, has a lot of guidance on how to do testing and principles to apply, for example, around validation. But then there's also quite closely linked is the regulation for test methods when it comes to the safety of chemicals. And that is almost become synonymous now with OECD test guidelines and a whole system of mutual acceptance of data that allows international trade. But this is all at the this is all at the EU level, but we have trade outside of those borders as well. So we can bring in other countries too. So the UK leaving the EU, their version is now UK REACH, or as I heard someone mention the other day, they called it British REACH, and so it's now called BREACH. The US version is something called TOSCA. Canada, Australia, these are just a few examples. South Korea has K-REACH as well. So different countries have different legislations and they have different approaches. So if you take the US version and Canada, they approach industrial chemicals by splitting it in two. So you have an existing set of chemicals, they have different processes for those substances. And then for new substances, you do a different approach again. So they've done it in a slightly different way. And also the approach of hazard versus exposure. So they're seen as a slightly different focus when it comes to doing their risk assessment as well. Also, in terms of the international system, their relationship is a bit different. So, for example, the GHS, the Globally Harmonized System on Labeling and Packaging, in America, they don't apply that to pesticides. So it can get quite complicated as to who is doing what and how they've implemented it. But then that's at the point of what is going into the environment, into the products that we have, who's then doing checks on this. So that is in the EU left to member states. So these are just examples that the UK has used to implement enforcement. So there's a separate regulation when it comes to enforcing REACH, which looks at the penalties and the roles and responsibilities on whether checks should be done. And then there's a whole host of other regulations which set standards for different products. So toy safety, that's what's, safety levels of what you can have for phthalates in plastics, construction products, and so on. And all member states will have a different approach to this as well. But there's then a whole load of other regulations. So if you think about the environment, you've got the Water Framework Directive, you've got the Waste Framework. If we're moving hazardous substances, then we're thinking about imports and prior informed consent. There's substance-specific regulations, like for persistent organic pollutants and mercury and so on. Occupational health as well, looking after workers. And then it's not just the processes, but also the people. And again, these aren't all the stakeholders that are involved, but if you think about the agencies, we've got ECHA, we've got EFSA, different committees, there's industry, developers, enforcement agencies like the Environment Agency, policy departments as well. So it really can be quite a complex and difficult world to really understand and to see what connections there all are. I've not connected these in any way. This is just to show or give a taster of some of the things that we need to be aware of if we're saying, if we're talking about regulation, what do we mean? So a question that we can ask is, if we have this world of regulation and there's all those different areas, does it work? Or perhaps more importantly, does it actually work well? So the guy on the right, I selected him for two reasons. One is because he reminded me of the Toothless Dragon from How to Train Your Dragon films. But actually, this is a plush toy of an axolotl, so it seemed quite apt for a talk about chemicals. And the reason why I found this is because there was an announcement by or release of information from the UK authorities of the trading standards enforcement. So they had stopped a consignment coming into the country, coming into the UK, and tested these, and they found that as a toy, these were above the recommended level for phthalates in toys. So these were removed from the Amazon marketplace and they were rejected at the border. So if we look at that in terms of, there was the use of regulations to understand what is harmful, and it was applied to say what standards would be safely allowed, and then there was enforcement to ensure that that actually happened. So yes, it does work well to a certain extent. Also, if we look at all the different regulations and what is it that they're trying to achieve, they have different objectives. So as I mentioned before, some are based on approval processes, others are just looking at risk management and identifying risk management measures. Some may be about communication and labeling, and then you get down to sort of authorizing and restricting the use of different substances, either in the whole or perhaps for specific uses or in specific industries, and doing monitoring. So that's also quite a difficult question, as to saying whether all of these things actually work well. But obviously we're all aiming to have a high level of protection. So does it work well? Well, we do know that there are under-evaluated chemicals. So we hear about this. There was the image that you might be familiar with from the European Environment Agency of the iceberg, which is showing that of the 100,000 chemicals on the market in the EU, 75% of them are under-evaluated. And that might be because they're in smaller quantities that they're produced, so they don't need to meet the requirements, or because the authorities that are doing the evaluations haven't got round to checking all of the substances yet. And there are aspects that we know that we feel are under-regulated, areas like mixtures and so on. And some of this comes into the issue of resourcing. So we know about the budget squeeze that the authorities tend to have. So there was talk about, in the UK recently, there were some discussions about how well UK REACH was being implemented. And it was noted that when the UK was part of the EU, obviously as a group of member states together, that is a more efficient way. You can share out the burden of evaluating all of these substances. But even then, the UK only had 10 people looking at substance evaluation, which to me just didn't seem as many as I thought it would be. And then more recently, it came out that in the last year, there were 3 million procedures done on animals. Now, that's not all to do with REACH, it is to do with wider research, but it's just all of the types of procedures that may be done. And the number of inspectors to check and to enforce that it was all being done correctly was only 23. And again, that didn't quite seem like a particularly reasonable balance. And again, I'm not saying that any of those stakeholders are doing anything wrong. But where regulations come in is not just to offer an incentive, but if they're going to be offering a disincentive to act in a bad way, then that really needs to have some teeth. You need to have sufficient deterrent to ensure that people follow the regulations that are there. And then a final thing of does it work well is then safety testing. If we're saying that we want to be protecting against harms, then particularly with chemicals, we need to ensure that they're safe, or we need to understand what harms they may cause so that we can put in risk management measures. But what is it that we're doing in order to identify whether substances are safe or not? So that, of course, brings me on to animal testing. So some of you may remember Pinky and the Brain. So these were the lab mice that every night had a discussion about what they were going to do that evening, and they were going to try and take over the world. Now, these two are actually the least of my worries that maybe Pinky and the Brain one day may take over the world. But it's to make the point of, animal testing has its problems in many other ways. So first of all, we're using methods from around the 1950s. And if we think about how far science has come in that time, is that really the best practices that we have? If you thought about what your life would be like if we used other science and technology from the 1950s, what our phones and our homes and our fashion as well, things have really moved on at that point. If we look at the legislative endpoints or the objectives, are animal testing the best way to meet those points? We know that there is science developing, being able to show that it's not fit for purpose. We see from even pharmaceutical development and the testing done there, that having got through so many stages, testing on animals and then moving on to the human trials, that there's still a high proportion that fail because there's toxicity that wasn't identified. So between the two, are they actually being protected? There's the economic argument as well that can be made around animal testing. And I think still at the moment it can be argued both ways, but it's seen that, housing animals and having to do repeat studies, it's an expensive way to do science. And of course, we've got the ethical issue as well. But overall, how is it then that we meet aims when it comes to safety testing? So I'm going to move on to talking about a piece of legislation in particular, and I've chosen REACH. So thank you very much for S Club 7 for that aptly named song. And so we're going to take a step back and have a look at how one piece of legislation addresses protective aims and what that then looks like in practice. So when we have legislation, we start with a preamble at the beginning, which is usually like the policy focus. What's the point of it? What's it trying to achieve? You then have the articles, which provides the detail or a bit more of the detail of roles and responsibilities. And then you tend to get much more of the detail in the annexes. So if we take a look at REACH, preamble for the start, as I mentioned before, should ensure a high level of protection of human health and the environment. So that's great. It also talks about sustainable development. So that's really quite positive in terms of its worrying about future generations as well. We then start to talk about alternative methods and the promotion of these. So this is good. This is obviously where the thinking of NAMs comes in, and that we're not using animal testing. And we start to see lines about the precautionary principle as well. So this is good for science. It's saying that if the science is not conclusive, but there may be a harm there, then it's not sufficient to not take action. If there's any thinking that some harm might be caused, we should be precautionary and take measures against it. We then look to industry as well. So industry are manufacturing this, but it is their responsibility to ensure that there is care taken and that there is no adverse effects. So that's fine. This is again about roles and responsibilities. So industry are responsible as the polluter pays, and there is that accountability there. So that's fine. And then we get into other stakeholders as well. So we've got commission, member states and so on, promoting alternative test methods. And it's even starting to bring in some specific when it comes to the NAMs that could be used to identify the harms. So we're talking about toxicogenomics, computer methods, in vitro methods. So that's great too. And finally, we it brings in about the 3 Rs. So replace, reduce, refine, animal testing. So overall, this all sounds really positive. I feel quite reassured that the idea of this is to protect me as a person, and that we're not going to be using animal testing to do that, mostly really from an ethical point of view, so it appears. So why is it then that we still have this conversation around animal testing? And what is it then that perhaps is wrong in the rest of the text of REACH that means that we end up in that way? And so overall, we can turn to Tina Turner, and she asked, what's NAMS got to do with it? I mean, she actually asked, what's love got to do with it? But maybe NAMS and love have some similarities. They're both there to look out for the best for other people. So I've just pulled out 3 bits of REACH here, which help to give us an idea of where NAMS come in. So Article 13, we're now in the body of the text of REACH, information generated, and I'll come on to what we're looking at in terms of information in a moment, but it should be by means other than vertebrate animal testing. Article 25 of REACH, we're talking about vertebrate animal testing only as a last resort. So we're not only saying that there should be alternatives, but we're also saying that that should be used first, so it could be read, because animal testing is not until the end. And then we can move to the annexes of REACH as well. So this is where all the detail comes in. And Annex 11 starts to talk about adaptations. So we're seeing that there is the option there to use existing data. These are the ways that we're not going to use animal testing, what's already in the public domain or available. Weight of evidence approaches, we can use lots of different pieces of information to make an argument. We've got some very specific mentions of NAMs as well, so QSARs and in vitros, and different processes that we can use, so grouping and read across. Now, there is some discussions around how much the legislation then actually helps in terms of some of these. So if you read the adaptations, the weight of evidence, it doesn't give you a great deal of information, but we do know that soft law guidance helps around this. But what is it then that's the problem? If we've got it in REACH, in the articles and the annexes, we're talking about adaptations, we've got it in the preamble, that's the policy direction. So what is actually going on? Well, if we then turn to the detail of what's in the annex, I've just pulled a little bit out just to give a bit of a flavour of what's going on. And we can start to see more of the direction of travel. So this is just some of the text from the toxicological and eco-tox requirements when it comes to that information that's needed in order to show that substances are safe. So we see it on the top that this is a tiered approach. So there's certain requirements at 1 tonne per year, another at manufacture and imports at 10 tonnes, and so on. The idea here is that you always start at the 1 tonne, and then if you're actually producing 10 tonnes, you do the 1 tonne plus the 10 tonnes. So you're adding all of these requirements together. So first of all, we can see that if you're producing or importing less than a tonne per year, there isn't any requirements. This is outside of that. But the first set of requirements, then we're looking at skin irritation, serious eye damage, acute toxicity. When we move up then to the 10 tonnes, that's when we start to bring in, only at this point, the reproductive screening. So up until that point, we haven't covered that. At the 100 tonnes per year, we see further testing when it comes to like reproductive toxicity, prenatal development. And you're starting to really get a feel that there is a focus on animal testing here, because we're talking about 90 days and prenatal development. And then we get to 1,000 tonnes, we're bringing in vivo, certain terms here, second in vivo testing on other mammals. So there's a number of issues here. One is that, having said we're not going to be doing animal testing, the detail appears to go down this route. And the second issue is that this is cumulative. So we're not requiring that we do know about all substances. We're just knowing about some substances in different amounts of information, in different amounts of detail. And this is because the idea is that when it comes to 1,000 tonnes per year, we're equating that with our exposure. So if you're importing or manufacturing a higher amount of chemical, then people must be being exposed at a greater level, and that's therefore where the risk is. So excuse the pun, I've included Band-Aid here because the term is band-aid for a bullet wound. If we're actually trying to have protection from harm, is this really what we're thinking of as a way to achieve that? This is basically the interpretation of meeting that aim, is to have these as endpoints and these as the requirements. So what does this mean for NAMs? What we'd like to see is NAMs, lots of NAMs. Taking this from the Matrix, I'm sorry, where it's guns, lots of guns. But the idea here is that they're both tools to get a means to an end. So coming us back to precision TOX and to ASPIS, the work that we've been doing at the law school under precision TOX is looking at the socio-technical barriers to the uptake of NAMs. So work done with Professors Robert Lee and Alexandra Kowalski, also of the law school. We've been speaking with stakeholders, so across industry, policy, in different jurisdictions around the world, to understand why it is and what needs to be done to get NAMs included in chemical risk assessments. What is it in terms of their perceptions that's holding this back? We've had a look at the legislation there, but that's only part of the story. If we see that the preamble and the direction of travel that's really expected, why is it that if we've got this great science, why are we not using it? And so this has highlighted a number of different areas. So for instance, there's the idea of regulatory culture. So we're apprehensive about using NAMs because it's a new way of working. Things have been done a certain way for such a long time, and everyone else does it as well. There's comfort in that. There's also the familiarity that we have with animal studies. There's confidence in seeing that harmful endpoint. You see a tumor or you see damage to tissue. It's different when you then hear about some bioactivity or some perturbation in cells. We hear about perceived lack of trust between stakeholders, conflicts of interest, concerns of bias as well. There's misperceptions around processes of what we really mean when we're talking about validation and standardization. As we mentioned before, there's different pressures as well in terms of time and resources, economics, expertise too. There's fears from civil society that although there's the ethical argument, what actually does it mean if NAMs, the fear is, don't have such a high level of protection? What if safety standards are actually being diluted? And so, there's quite a lot of issues here that altogether mean that we've kind of ended up where we are. And something that we've also come to identify is that there's just not that imperative yet to transition. So yes, we can make the different arguments about the value of the science and of the economics and the ethical side, but altogether that's just not being clearly communicated and clearly believed as being now is the point that we can move. I'm not going to say too much or much more really on the barriers. Some of you already heard some of our presentations, but the report is now available on our website. So where does this leave us for our next step? So this then brings us on to our very own chemical brothers. The idea here that is behind precision TOX is that it is interdisciplinary. So we've got Professor John Colborne from biosciences, Professor Robert Lee from law. The idea of the project is that we're kind of bringing different areas together, because working silo doesn't always work. So you can be doing some really great science, but if it's not being communicated, and I can bring in Francois here as well, again, just to represent all the different aspects of precision TOX and all the work that needs to be done. But together, it means that we can start moving things forward. So our work that we're going to carry on doing is on solutions now. So looking at so some of the aspects that have been brought up, what can we suggest in terms of action plan and what could happen in the future so that we can get to more protective. So we're looking at the framework, what the capacity is in there. So as we did a little bit of an introduction before about what the wording says in the legislation, but needing to look across that chemical world that I showed you earlier, what are the implications of what we do? Some of the soft law as well, drafting guidance as to standardization and some of the processes that could perhaps be put in place when it comes to using some of these NAMs. But the really important point is that it is interconnected, interdisciplinary. You know, it's about working and seeing the capabilities and the capacities of each of these different areas of communications, of law, of NAM science, so that altogether it could be moved to try and create that really comprehensive picture and that imperative that we really should be using and really can use NAMs as well. So just then, my penultimate slide of looking to the future, and we can look at a much bigger picture. You know, this is precision TOX, but actually this sits at a really important time at the moment because it's part of a much wider conversation. So there's work at the moment done or being developed by the European Commission on a roadmap to phase out animal testing. There's work being done through PARC, for example, on next generation risk assessment and the route to getting that implemented. And there's loads of debates going on that the idea of hazard versus exposure, the toxic free environment, one substance, one assessment, one health. You know, this is a really important time that the project is sitting within. There's discussion as well about, you know, should it be an evolution or a revolution? But really, it's all coming down to how is it that we can implement NAMs? And NAMs are really, you know, a really positive approach because they have such great potential. As we saw in the chemical world, it's got so much different utility. You've got industrial chemicals, pesticides, pharmaceuticals, and that's great. But it also means that they're very complex if we think about NAMs. You know, it's an umbrella term. It encompasses lots of different technologies, lots of different science, and it's just a different world that people then need to get used to. And part of that then comes back to regulation as being an issue. So we said about how it works because there are those requirements that you saw in the annex. And it said that regulations are a means of technocratic administration. You know, it works because it creates criteria and it creates almost that legal certainty that people seek. But when you have NAMs and they're developing quickly, and when you work in an area that has that inherent uncertainty, as chemical testing does, then sometimes that makes it a little bit more tricky. And it means that it opens up greater opportunity for lawyers and judges to come in because you've got that issue around interpretation. But maybe then we can also extend that argument or the debate to saying, are we then still even regulating chemicals, or have we moved over to the domain of regulating technology? And maybe that needs a rethink as well. But regulation, if we go back to the start with Warren G, it has such a wide term. When you're regulating something, that is a broad spectrum of options that are actually available to us. So it might be that there are punitive, restrictive areas like command and control, or you can move across to standards and industry schemes or market-based mechanisms. So actually chemical regulation, there's plenty of options there that we maybe could draw on, and that moves us into a very different looking future, potentially. And obviously this is something that precision TOX can feed into with the science, embedding it in translation and addressing some of those social concerns, but that encompasses us as well, because we are the people that live in this world, so we're protecting ourselves too. Now, for some of you who were coming onto this thinking, I know exactly what she's going to say, we're going to talk about dark waters and it's going to be the toxic songs. I know I haven't included them, but that's because this was a talk about alternatives. So actually this was more of an alternative tour of chemical regulation. But that is me done, so thank you very much. And I pass back to Leonie.
Thanks, Laura, for giving this really interesting way of getting an overview about chemical regulation internationally, but also specifically in Europe. You made my day with the Chemical Brothers reference, and ask the people of Precision TOX if we want to have. So I want to open this up for questions. So if any of you have questions directed at Laura, you can put it in the QA and I can read them out. But you can also raise your hand if you have this icon, which I'm not sure, but you can also just put your name in the chat and then I can pull you up to the screen to talk to Laura directly. Maybe I will start with some questions that I have. Laura, the work that you do, and I know it because we have cooperated in Precision Talks for the last 1.5 to 2 years. So I know your research, the work that you do is quite interdisciplinary. You pull methods and techniques from very different research fields. You look at method development, legislation, change research. How has it been for you working at on such an interdisciplinary topic? Because I imagine it's quite interesting, but maybe you can elaborate on that experience.
Yeah, so I certainly find it interesting. So my background, as you said in the introduction, was environmental science, and then I had quite a meandering route to actually get here. So I have a background working for DEFRA policy in the UK. I work for a regulatory agency as well, and I'm now at the law school. And part of that is because, you know, I haven't been able to sort of specialize as such. I think I hadn't sort of found my niche because I find all of these different aspects really interesting. And you know, I see the importance, and I think everyone else does now, of that interdisciplinary side. But having spoken about it for a lot of the time, I think we're still not necessarily very good at putting it into practice. And I think that's where this project is really important, and where the role that kind of the law school sits, and the research that we're doing on sort of the socio-legal aspects and working with the science as well. It's and through the project, you know, it's just sort of bringing it all together, and it's being a forum that allows everyone to come together. You know, it's not just a science project, it's not just a law project, it's actually getting everyone in a room together or online together, or in discussions together. That means that we can, you know, we can actually take what is a multifaceted problem and come up with solutions that kind of work on many different lenses. So I find it really interesting, and I love to hear about the science, and I think it's fascinating all the different NAMs, that there are the different technology platforms, how they're developing all the time. I find it really interesting, you know, the social side, that some of those ideas that we were hearing in the interviews that we had on the socio-technical barriers, you know, really understanding why it is that people as individuals, you know, are struggling with NAMs. And I think that's just a really interesting ideas to me, and to then be thinking about how we overcome them and taking that positive approach, you know, that just really kind of, that really rings for me. It's something that I'd like to be involved in. So yeah, very fortunate, I think, that we have this project. I don't know about anyone else.
Maybe I can add a question. You mentioned that your work for Precision Talks will now move from the barriers report to the solutions finding of how NAMs can be picked up in regulation of chemicals. And for that, you will all also have quite an interdisciplinary approach from what I gathered. Maybe you can give everyone in the audience just a brief overview of what is planned in that regard, also in the sense of stakeholder integration and having as many opinions and insights at the table as possible.
Yeah, so what's really important about the solutions work is we're taking a smaller subset of people, but the idea is that we really want to have some of those conversations that need to be had about what are the solutions, and not sort of allowing people to just keep finding fault. You know, we've done the barriers stuff. Let's now look at what we can put in place. And we're not looking to come up with, you know, we're not fixing the world necessarily, but what are some really key aspects that we can identify, that we can propose as being like actions that should be taken forward, or recommendations. But this is across a range of stakeholders. So, you know, hopefully there are a number of voices representing the different stakeholder groups at each session. And using the barriers work so that we can challenge what's being said as well, because that's the wider voice that we've got. So if we come up, if the suggestion is brought in or raised, making sure that we kind of cover those main themes that we identified in the barriers report to make sure, we might not come up with something perfect, but that we've at least recognized some of the barriers and what steps need to be taken to overcome some of the issues, but not letting it just sit within a science problem or within a legal problem. But what is it? As we say, communication, really big issue, and communicating well and being really clear about how we talk, and when we're communicating, what does that mean? Who are we talking to? What type of information do they want? Is it sufficient to keep coming out with 80-page documents like we did with the barriers report? Actually, with the great help of TOX, it got whittled down to 1 pages and 3 pages, so that for different audiences, it's in a different format, so that hopefully it's more accessible to them. So that's just sort of one example. But yeah, it's just trying to come up and taking those disciplines and taking those different points of view to create something that actually is a little bit more of a holistic feel, and that we've tried to kind of cover as many bases as we can, as a well-rounded solution suggestion.
Thanks. We have one question from Christina Kramer, and she asks, what timeline do you think might be realistic for seeing NAMs really take off or over in regulation from your experience working in ASPIS and your studies in precision TOX?
Oh, I'm going to bat that one away, and I'm going to refer back. I'm going to refer back to some of the interviews that we had, just because that was interesting. We didn't ask that specifically as a question, but you sort of got a feel through the interviews, and it was very much the idea that it's not going to be, or it's unlikely to be a revolution. It's more likely to be an evolution, something step by step, that we will slowly get there. I think the key is that it's less slow and more directed now. We've got the policies there, but there isn't that imperative. And so yes, I think dates are useful because it kind of focuses the mind, but you can have a good policy and you can have a bad policy, but they can be both ruined by bad implementation. So I think that's more what's important for me at the moment, is making sure that route to a transition is really well thought out, because I'd hate to think that steps were taken and the sort of outcome of it was that, well, we just won't bother, it's too difficult. So let's not put a date necessarily that you could fail with, but I still think it's quite useful to have aspirations, to have an idea, partly for industry, but I don't just mean, think industry like NAM developers as well. It's good for them, to hear from policy what plans are, so that they can make investment decisions as well. It's going to create new markets in terms of what the CROs are doing, biomarker industries, things like that. Markets, is that there's planning that needs to be done for that as well. So there was a lot of talk about sort of 5 years, 10 years. That was probably the figure that was mostly brought up. So that's positive, in as much as it's not another 15 or 20 years. Yeah, I think for me, most important is how we do it, and that we have a good plan that we can implement for that.
Yes, and we have heard in the past the timelines, or in other parts of the world's agency have set themselves deadlines until when they definitely want to phase out animal testing. For example, the US EPA, for example, if I remember correctly, Laura, you might know this better than I, they put out the specific date, also just to create a target that we could work towards too. But I agree with you, Laura. It is a lot about how we achieve this process and make sure it's good and robust in the process.
But
maybe
yeah, I
you
think
can.
the US did row back on that. So again, it's like, do you
Yes.
want to come out with a policy that then creates more confusion when you then maybe have to remove it? And is it better don't remove it, maybe kind of reconfigure it a little bit? So yeah, I think it's very difficult, you know, if we're talking about businesses and businesses planning, just as we do with any other transition, you know, the energy transition, green technologies are wanting to know kind of what backing are they getting, what support are they getting, and is it incentives or is it disincentives? So yeah, it's a very difficult um, decisions to make as to how you do a transition. But yeah, definitely, I think how is most important or very important.
Yes, and in that regard, we will see a lot of guidance or direction will come out in the near future with the Commission's work on the roadmap to transition away from animal testing. And I want to briefly highlight at this point to for anyone who doesn't in the audience to maybe follow the Precision Talks LinkedIn page, and also Laura specifically, because she has been communicating on events from the Commission, also Parliament in the past, informing about the research that comes out of Precision Talks when it comes to barriers. And then in the future, we also plan to have different information events on the solution report that is expected to come out early next year. So are there any more questions from the audience at this point? But you can, or if anyone wants to directly interact with Laura, let me know. If this isn't the case, we still have some time left, but we can also close at this point. I want to thank everyone for participating today and listening to Laura's presentation. Laura, thank you for preparing a very engaging presentation on a topic that might seem to some a bit dry and distant. So thanks for making the effort to make it really fun and approachable. And yeah, people, let me know if you want to see the Chemical Brothers t-shirts. Maybe we can have it as a prize for the best poster award during upcoming conferences. I would certainly enjoy having one of those. So thank you very much, Laura. Thank you for everyone for joining us today. And we'll see you at the next Precision Talks Café Scientifique that's planned to happen in April. Take care and see you next time.